100 to 500 millimeter zoom is probably not the most common lens you'll see being used in the video world. Though, of course, if your interest is in wildlife cinematography or even some kinds of sports, then this lens can certainly serve you just as well as it does for the sports or wildlife photographer. Now, I have to say, this lens, or testing this lens, has proven to be quite the challenge. It's pushed my capabilities and methodologies to the absolute limits, and as a result, I do suggest taking these numbers with a little bit healthier grain of salt than any of the other tests that I've shown in this breathing series. Additionally, unsurprisingly, for a stills-focused super telephoto zoom, the RF 100 to 500 millimeter f4.5 to 7.1 LIS USM breathes. However, due to a combination of the long focal length and the way the lens typically will be used, the breathing it does exhibit doesn't seem to be nearly as annoying as a similar level can be at a shorter focal length. Now, if you're new to all of this, you might be wondering, what the heck is this guy talking about? What is breathing? Clearly, my lens is glass and plastic, not flesh and blood, so what is it doing? Well, put simply, breathing is the term we use to describe a change in angle of view that accompanies focusing. This aberration is a problem for video shooters where the change in composition while focusing can become very distracting. Fortunately, purpose-built video and cinema lenses are designed not to do this. Unfortunately, for most of us using hybrid lenses or DSLR lenses on our mirrorless cameras, well, many of our lenses still suffer from this aberration. Now, with that said, my testing protocol for this is very straightforward. I stick a pair of white targets, really just a bit of white gaffer tape, on a black background. I then position my camera so those two targets are near the edge of the frame, but do not exceed them. I then use my camera's focus bracketing function to produce a sequence of images starting at the minimum focus distance for the lens and shooting out to infinity. Now, for completeness, these test images are shot as small JPEGs, so technically any size will work. There also aren't any advantages to using RAW here, so I don't. I do have distortion correction enabled, however, as I think that better reflects how these lenses will be used, and because there are an increasing number of lenses that will not let you disable it, I think it makes for a fairer comparison. Now, the real magic in this whole process happens on the computer. I feed the JPEGs into some software that I wrote that measures the distance between the target centers in each frame, and then ultimately compares them to the last image taken, which, hopefully if I did everything right, was taken at infinity focus. Now, since the infinity focus position tells us the lens's true focal length and therefore true angle of view, I can compare each frame to that infinity frame to determine how much the angle of view is changing and then plot that against focus distance, focus position, or really anything I'd like. Okay, so with the formalities out of the way, let's take a look at the data for this lens, starting at the 100mm zoom position. At the maximum angle of view shift I measured at 100 millimeters was right around 4.6% wider. Given that the 100 millimeter zoom position has an equivalent angle of view as if it was a 95.4 millimeter lens, assuming everything worked perfect. Now, all things considered, this is actually quite good or well controlled as it is for this kind of lens. Moreover, if the magnitude of breathing is low enough, some breathing may not be distracting enough to ruin your shot. In an effort to address this, I also look at how much of a focus shift is needed for the lens to see a 2% change in angle of view compared to infinity. With this lens at 100 millimeters, that 2% shift point occurs at 7 feet or 2.1 meters from the camera. Now, while this is significant, it is also not nearly as bad as I have seen in, say, the old EF70-200 f4 LIS USM that I have tested previously. Now, moving along to the next marked focal length, or 135 millimeters, this lens continues to perform reasonably well. The overall focus error here is right around 4.2% wider at the minimum focus distance, and that means that the lens has an angle of view that's roughly equivalent to just over 129 millimeters at close focusing. Now, like with the previous test, the 2% shift distance ends up being at around 4.5 feet or just under 1.4 meters from the camera. Again, another decent result. At 200 millimeters, we see the angle of view shift continue its trend of decreasing with the increased focal length. At this focal position or zoom position, I measured a maximum angle of view shift of right around 3.3% wider. This means that at the minimum focus distance, the angle of view you see is roughly equivalent to using a 193 millimeter lens. Now, as for that 2% shift distance, I make it out to be right around 1 meter or 39 inches from the camera. Now, while the angle of view shift so far has generally been improving, at 300 millimeters, things take a turn for the worse. I measured the maximum angle of view shift here at about 6% wider. This translates to a 300 millimeter or to the 300 millimeter zoom position having the same angle of view as approximately a 292 millimeter lens if everything was perfect. Now that said, the threshold distance here is right around 4.5 feet or just under 1.4 meters in front of the camera. Moving on to the 400 millimeter position, the maximum measured angle of view shift has increased to just under 10%, again, wider. This means that your minimum focus distance, you're looking at the equivalent of losing 40 millimeters in total focal length or shooting at about a 360 millimeter angle of view. Again, at the closest focus distance. Now that 2% threshold distance has also jumped quite significantly at this position as well. It's now out at just under 11 feet or 3.4 meters. Now finally, at the 500 millimeter position, the angle of view shift has increased to 13.9%. And the 2% threshold distance has increased to 13 feet or 3.9 meters. This means that at the minimum focus distance, the lens that you're working with has the same angle of view as if it was a 430 millimeter lens. So with that data in hand, let's talk about this for a moment. Now, if you've seen my other videos in this series, you may have noticed that many of the charts in this test are not nearly as clean or well-defined or have such a nice curve as you've seen in many of the past videos. At the present, I don't actually have a good explanation for this. Though I do have some ideas. Given that this is the first lens that I have tested with 2 focusing elements and dual focus motors, that may be a big part of the explanation. As we've seen repeatedly in past tests with internal focusing lenses, how the angle of view shifts depends very much on the specifics of each lens design. With 2 focusing motors, it is entirely possible that the breathing is going to be affected in odd ways as those 2 elements are not being moved the same way as a single focusing element would. That said, there were also a number of difficulties in testing this lens that probably warrant some further investigation as well. With the shallow depth of field created by the long focal lengths, even when stopped down significantly, it is not hard for the test points to be blurred essentially almost into oblivion. For long focal length lenses, it may be necessary to devise a better test setup that's more capable of providing accurate angular information at all focus distances as opposed to what I'm using. And that's ultimately why I suggest that taking these numbers with a little bit more of a grain of salt than I would with the other tests. So with that said, I hope you found this useful or at least interesting. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. If you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us by liking and sharing this video. You can also support us directly by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of our affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.